Your Honor, the state would call Brianna Giles to the stand.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
See? And if you feel comfortable removing your mask, we'd prefer you do so to be able to be heard clearly. And begin by giving us your full name, spelling each of your names.
Brianna Giles, BREAHNAGILES.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Giles, how are you currently employed?
I'm a forensic scientist in the drug chemistry section of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, also known as the BCA.
And can you describe for the jurors your educational background to be a forensic scientist?
I earned my Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and my Master's of Science in Biomedical Forensic Sciences from Boston University. I've also undergone various training in both of my employment.
So when did you obtain your bachelor's degree in biochemistry?
2009.
And your master's?
2011.
And where have you worked since obtaining your Bachelor of Science degree in this field?
I worked for 4 years in Dallas County, Texas, at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences as a drug chemist in the forensic science.
And how long did you do that?
4 years.
And when did you leave that job?
2017.
And where did you go to work from there?
At the BCA.
And have you been at the BCA ever since?
Yes.
And do you have any professional affiliations, any groups that you belong to?
Yes.
And can you tell the jurors what those are?
I am a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, a member of the Midwestern Academy of Forensic Sciences, and a member of the Clandestine Laboratory Investigating Chemists Association.
And can you tell the jurors, in maintaining your competence in this field, what kind of trainings you go to?
I attend various conferences, webinars, keep up on current articles, and try and stay up to date with all of the changing discipline in our field.
So what kinds of things do you do as a chemist at the BCA?
I analyze unknown substances for the presence or absence of controlled substances and generate reports on those findings, maintain the chain of custody, and testify in court as needed.
And were you asked to perform some testing on items in the case that brings us to court today?
Yes.
And do you recall what the first item was that you tested?
Yes.
And what was that item?
It was an apparent glass pipe.
And given your history, your work history and your training and experience, did you inspect that visually? And if so, what did you think of it?
Yes, I inspected it visually and performed analysis according to our policies and procedures.
And what kind of testing did you do on that pipe?
I performed a presumptive test and a confirmation test.
What's the presumptive test?
In this case, the presumptive test was a color test.
What does that tell you?
It gives me an indication of what the substance could be.
So how do you, test the pipe? What do you do to get something to test?
For a pipe or an apparent type of smoking device, I will scrape out a portion of residue that is on the device and use that for testing.
And so with this particular pipe, did you find any like green leafy material or anything of that nature?
There was only visible charred residue.
And in your job as a chemist for the BCA, How often do you see this where you have a pipe with some residue in it?
Very often.
And so did you perform some testing on that residue?
Yes.
And did you follow all the procedures necessary for a chemist at the BCA in doing that testing?
Yes.
And what were the results of that testing?
That the material contained tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and that no marijuana was identified.
So what does that mean? What is THC?
It is the main psychoactive ingredient found in marijuana.
And by finding no marijuana, what do you mean by that?
There was no visible plant material that was able to be identified as marijuana.
And so this would indicate that it had been used at some point in the past, is all, right? It's a really poorly worded question, isn't it? The finding of this residue, does that really tell you anything about the pipe itself?
Just that the pipe contained the material that was found.
And were you asked to conduct some additional testing on some other items, or some testing on some additional items, I should say?
Yes.
And did that include item 48?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jurors what item 48 is?
A white round tablet with apparent pharmaceutical markings.
Now, were there actually 2 pills in item 48?
Yes.
And did you test them at separate times?
Yes.
Okay. When you initially tested them, can you describe for the jurors, the condition of item 48, or at least one of the pills? Well, let me ask you this way. Did the 2 pills look consistent with one another?
Yes.
And so can you describe for the jurors the appearance of the pill when you saw it?
Both pills appeared the same, both white and round with markings, RP on one side and 10/325 on the other side.
And you mentioned earlier pharmaceutical markings. What did you mean by that?
The markings RP 10325, they had a mark or a logo on both sides of the tablet.
Now, in your job, do you have to become familiar with how manufacturers mark their pills?
Somewhat, yes.
And when you saw these markings, did you recognize them as anything?
I did not.
So they're just markings on those pills.
Yes.
And so it's not like you recognize these as markings for aspirin or something of that nature.
Correct.
And so initially you only tested one of the pills. Why was that?
Per our policy at the BCA, typically when we receive multiple tablets in a submission, we only will analyze one of that population if they're all similar, unless it is requested that additional tablets are analyzed.
And did that in fact happen here?
Yes.
Who requested that do you remember who requested that you test both pills?
Agent Ryerson.
Okay. And describe for the jurors how you go about testing these pills.
With tablets that will have markings, the first thing I will do will be take a weight of the tablet. The second would be to look up the markings using a database to determine if they're pharmaceutically made type of tablets, which would give me an indication of what the tablet could contain. And that would be followed by a confirmatory test to show what's in the tablet.
So these markings you did not recognize as any manufacturer's marking?
Not upon my visual observation.
And then, so how do you take a sample of these pills for testing?
I use a razor blade and scrape off a portion of the pill.
And what kind of testing do you do on these pills, or did you do on these pills?
So the first type of testing is looking up the markings, and upon looking up the markings in the database, the markings did indicate the material contained oxycodone and acetaminophen. I followed that up by scraping off a portion of the tablets and putting it into a liquid, and that liquid is then injected onto a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, or GCMS.
Now, you indicated that the markings on the pills indicated, I'm going to butcher it if I try it, but that they contained what?
Oxycodone and acetaminophen.
Now, in your experience and your training in this field, do you know whether sometimes homemade pills are given those same markings to make them look legitimate?
Yes.
That can happen?
Yes.
And so in this case, you got that initial indication from the markings, but you proceeded to follow through with the testing, correct?
Yes.
And you tested both of those pills, correct?
Yes.
And did you follow all the standard procedures you need to do when performing that kind of testing for your laboratory?
Yes.
And what were the results of the testing?
The tablets contained methamphetamine and fentanyl.
And are you able at the BCA lab to quantify how much methamphetamine or fentanyl are in those pills?
For methamphetamine, yes. For fentanyl, no.
And so were you asked to do some additional testing with other items in this case?
Yes.
And were those items 51, 52, and 53?
Yes.
All right, so let's look at item 51 first. That item, can you describe for the jurors the condition of that item when you saw it?
It appeared to be a partial white and pink tablet with no observable markings.
And did you then test that item as well?
Yes.
And again, cut a portion of it off for the testing?
Yes.
And did you follow the necessary procedures to conduct the testing on that item as well?
Yes.
And what were the results of that testing?
Methamphetamine.
And were you able to detect any other controlled substances in that pill through that testing?
Not conclusively.
And what do you mean by that?
Per our policies and our procedures, there are certain requirements that we have to conclusively identify a substance. Methamphetamine was the only substance that was identified.
So were there other substances that were not detected in a sufficient amount to have you identify them as present?
Yes.
And do you know what substance that would have been that you found that way?
Per our testing, I can't confirm or state any identity of those substances.
Okay. And that's because you have to have you have to identify a certain amount before you can say it's present.
Yes.
We might call that a threshold, right?
We don't use that word in this type of testing.
It's just not enough there to say it's there.
It doesn't meet all of the requirements that we have to give an identification.
I should have asked you just to explain rather than me try to do it. But, all right, so did you also then do testing on item 52?
Yes.
And did you incidentally weigh item 52?
Yes.
Do you remember the approximate weight?
0.019 plus or minus 0.005 grams.
So can you give us some scale there? Is that in terms of a pill? Is that a small weight, a large weight?
It was a partial amount of what would be a tablet. If you think of a normal type of Tylenol type tablet, you're going to get a weight approximately about 0.5 grams. This was 0.019.
And did you also conduct testing on item 52 using the appropriate procedures for your laboratory?
Yes.
And what was the result of that testing?
Methamphetamine.
Were you able to identify any other substances in that pill?
No.
And item 53, did you also conduct some testing on item 53?
Yes.
And can you describe the condition of item 53 when you looked at it?
Similar in appearance to item 51 and 52, only a much smaller amount.
Do you recall the weight of item 53?
It was less than 0.01 grams.
So even less than 52.
Yes.
And did you conduct testing on that item as well using the standard procedures in your laboratory?
Yes.
And what was the result of that testing?
Methamphetamine.
Were you able to call the presence of any other substances in item 53?
No.
And did you also, or did you conduct some testing on item 54?
I did not.
Why not?
That was not submitted to me for analysis.
Okay. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson?
Good afternoon. Just a couple of very brief questions, ma'am. The first test you did was the testing of the marijuana, correct? The pipe where you recovered THC, correct?
Yes.
All right. But then the second test you did in report number 9, you tested the pills that appeared to have the pharmaceutical markings, correct?
Yes.
You looked up those pharmaceutical markings. They were consistent with oxycodone, correct, and Tylenol?
And acetaminophen, yes.
And acetaminophen, okay. And the weight of those pills was 0.397 plus or minus 0.005 grams, correct?
That was the weight of one of those pills.
One of those pills. And those pills were, did not appear to be, you could see the pharmaceutical markings on them, right?
Yes.
Now, the items that you tested, 51, 52, and 53, 51 appeared to be a more consistent pill, correct? Like looked like a pill.
Yes, it looked like a partial pill.
And that weight was 0.269 plus or minus 0.005 grams, correct?
Yes.
And 52 was more of a part of what appeared to be a pill, right?
Yes.
And that was 0.019 grams, correct?
Yes.
Plus or minus the 0.005.
Yes.
And so the difference between item number 52 and item number 48 would be 0.39 grams, give or take, right?
Can you repeat what items those were?
Sure. Item 52 was 0.019, and item 48 was 0.397.
Yes.
Okay. And then you did, just to be clear, item 48 came from the center console of the Mercedes-Benz, or were identified as coming from the center console of the Mercedes-Benz, correct?
To my knowledge, yes.
And that's what was reported to you?
Yes.
And the other items, 51, 52, 53, and 54, they came from the back seat, or they were identified as coming from the back seat of Squad 320, correct?
I can't speak to 54,
But
but 51, 52, and 53, yes.
they were identified coming from the back seat of Squad 320.
Yes.
And in terms of is it fair to say that there was some evidence that didn't meet your laboratory scientific threshold or scientific standards that a different controlled substance was potentially present?
There were indications of other substances. I can't speak to whether they are controlled or not controlled substances.
Okay, and those were brought to the attention of everybody involved, right?
For business purposes, it is in my notes.
Okay, and that was fentanyl.
I can't confirm.
Because it simply didn't meet that laboratory requirement
Yes.
in terms of quantity, right?
The testing I did not have any type of quantitative measurement.
But in terms of whatever other markings you may be looking for, right? Whatever guidelines. You can't say it was or wasn't fentanyl.
Yes.
I have nothing further.
Anything further? All right, thank you. You may sit down.